What initially shocked Hollywood has now unfolded into something far more disturbing, leaving even the most seasoned experts utterly shaken. What began as an event that briefly captured the world's attention has now spiraled into a haunting, dark narrative that nobody could have anticipated. The shocking discovery of a preliminary forensic report has enabled investigators to narrow down a critical window of time during which the incident occurred. But what the report suggests is nothing short of chilling. It has not only raised the stakes, but also deepened the mystery, leaving even the most experienced professionals grappling with its implications. As the investigation continues, it becomes clear that this case is far more complex and insidious than anyone had imagined. Authorities have confirmed that the situation escalated at a terrifying pace, but what transpired inside the home was not the result of an impulsive, spur-of-the-moment outburst. It wasn't the sort of tragedy that happens in a split second, a moment of blind rage or panic. Instead, investigators believe that the horrific events that unfolded that night were the culmination of long-building tensions that had quietly been simmering beneath the surface for months, perhaps even years, waiting for the right moment to erupt. Sources who are familiar with the case suggest that the night may have begun much earlier, at Conan O'Brien's annual Christmas party, where several guests noticed Nick displaying clear signs of tension, unpredictability, and an uneasy, almost palpable nervous energy. Those who were there recall that Nick's behavior seemed off, a stark contrast to the jovial atmosphere of the gathering. He was distant, his body language tight, and he appeared unable to relax among the familiar faces. Something in his energy was unsettling, setting him apart from the rest of the guests, and it seemed as though an invisible storm was quietly brewing. What began as a small, seemingly insignificant argument, according to those present at the party, didn't dissipate when the event ended. Instead, it seemed to follow Nick long after the celebration had finished, lingering in the air like an unspoken tension. Sources report that the argument, which seemed trivial at the time, escalated in Nick's mind, continuing to fester and build until it reached a breaking point. The emotional weight of that disagreement seemed to push him further, setting the stage for the tragic series of events that would follow. After leaving the party, Nick allegedly returned to the Brentwood area, and although outwardly he appeared calm, his behavior was anything but. Investigators have described his movements as unnervingly controlled, with every step deliberate, as if he were consciously measuring each action. There was no outward panic, no sign of distress, just an eerie sense of calm. He moved through the world that night as though he were completely detached, his emotions tightly guarded behind a mask of composure. Surveillance footage and witness accounts from the evening suggest that, at least at first glance, there was nothing in Nick's actions to suggest anything out of the ordinary. He wasn't erratic or unpredictable in his behavior, and there were no alarming signs of distress. Yet this calm exterior only deepened the mystery surrounding him, unsettling the authorities even more. There was nothing immediately apparent to suggest that he was about to do something that would irrevocably alter the course of his life and the lives of others. This lack of outward signs made it all the more difficult to understand the violence that would soon follow. Later, records show that Nick checked into a nearby hotel, maintaining the same composed and quiet demeanor he had exhibited throughout the night. He paid for his room without drawing any attention to himself, walked calmly to his assigned space, and entered his room without incident. It seemed as though he was going about his business, detached from the world outside. There were no signs of distress, no moments of hesitation or panic, only a sense of eerie detachment. But it wasn't long before something troubling occurred. Nick quickly secured the services of Alan Jackson, one of the most high-profile and well-respected defense attorneys in the country. What's truly remarkable about this is the speed with which Nick hired Jackson, raising immediate concerns and questions about the motives behind such a swift decision. Why had he acted so quickly? What had driven him to make such a major decision without the typical delay that would accompany such a serious legal matter? Investigators were left wondering what had prompted Nick to hire one of the top criminal defense lawyers in the nation so swiftly. This wasn't just any attorney. It was a lawyer known for taking on the most complex, high-stakes cases, often at extraordinarily high costs. The suddenness of this decision raised significant questions. Was Nick preparing for something? Bigger, was this the result of a calculated move? Further adding to the intrigue, sources have suggested that the funds used to hire Jackson came from a family inheritance, a detail that adds another layer of complexity to the already murky situation. It's one thing for someone to hire a lawyer quickly. It's another thing entirely when the money used to fund such a decision comes from an inheritance, one that could potentially be in dispute. The inheritance funds raised immediate concerns about what Nick knew, what he was anticipating, and whether he was acting with the full awareness of the gravity of his actions. The speed and confidence with which he made this decision, choosing to act with such purpose and determination, have only fueled further speculation and raised suspicions about the true extent of his involvement in the events that would soon be revealed. This calculated move, seemingly well thought out, has led investigators to wonder what Nick knew about the situation and how much of it had been planned. Was this just a series of ill-fated decisions spiraling out of control, or was there something more insidious at play beneath the surface? As more details surface and the investigation continues, the public's curiosity only grows. What Nick did next would soon become part of the tragic sequence of events, but this initial legal maneuver is already a sign of something far deeper and more troubling than anyone initially realized. The public's attention now turns toward the answers to these questions, and what is certain is that Nick's actions, both before and after the incident, will continue to haunt those who seek to understand what truly happened that night. According to the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, the incident inside the home occurred sometime between midnight and the early morning hours, a narrow window that has become central to the investigation. What authorities found most unsettling was the complete absence of forced entry. There were no broken locks, no shattered doors, no signs of intrusion, because none were necessary. Investigators believe the individual responsible had unrestricted access to the residence, intimate familiarity with its layout, and a deep understanding of how the home functioned. This was not the act of an outsider, but someone who knew the space well enough to move through it without resistance or hesitation. Security footage later placed Nick at a hotel in Santa Monica at approximately 4:00 a.m., nearly 20 minutes away from the Brentwood residence. Despite the gravity of what had already occurred, hotel staff reported nothing unusual about his behavior. He appeared calm, composed, and emotionally distant, as if sealed off from the reality unfolding elsewhere. There were no visible signs of distress, no frantic phone calls, no urgency in his movements. Witnesses described him as sitting quietly, almost disconnected, as though existing in a separate mental space entirely. That quiet normalcy only deepened investigators' concern. Several hours later, concern escalated into full alarm when a scheduled visitor arrived at the home and received no response. Repeated calls went unanswered. When doors were finally opened, the silence inside told a devastating story. In that moment, everything changed. Authorities were called immediately and rushed to the scene. As they secured the residence, it became clear that what they were dealing with was not a sudden or random tragedy, but the final outcome of a night that had been unraveling slowly and silently, unnoticed until it was far too late. Earlier that same evening, around 9:00 p.m., surveillance footage from an Arco gas station near Exposition Park captured Nick purchasing a sports drink. The footage shows him appearing restless, pacing slightly, scanning his surroundings, but still composed enough to complete the transaction without drawing attention. There was an underlying tension in his movements, a subtle agitation that stood in contrast to his controlled exterior. Approximately 15 minutes later, at around 9:15 p.m., Nick was detained by lapped officers working alongside U.S. Marshals not far from the gas station. The arrest was strikingly quiet. There was no resistance, no confrontation, no explanation offered. He remained completely silent as officers took him into custody. Footage from the arrest shows a young man who appears emotionally exhausted rather than panicked, drained rather than frantic, as if something inside him had already collapsed. Subsequent forensic analysis suggested that the couple had likely passed several hours before they were discovered. This detail significantly altered the timeline and deepened the mystery surrounding the case. It forced investigators to confront a deeply troubling question. What truly pushed the situation past the point of no return? What occurred in those silent hours between the incident and its discovery remains one of the most haunting aspects of the investigation. Authorities now believe Nick may have attempted to clean himself either before leaving the house or later at the hotel. Despite these efforts, investigators suspect that traces of evidence may still remain. Surveillance cameras tracked his movements throughout Santa Monica later that same morning, providing a clearer picture of his actions after the incident. Forensic experts have indicated that the object involved was likely taken from inside the home, something ordinary, easily accessible, and familiar. The fact that such a commonplace item may have been used added a chilling dimension to the case. It suggested that no preparation was necessary, only access and opportunity. Familiarity became a central theme. Familiarity with the home, with routines, and with moments of vulnerability. As the investigation progressed, early assumptions were revised. Initial reports had suggested a single impulsive act, possibly driven by emotion. However, further forensic findings painted a far more disturbing picture. Evidence revealed multiple serious injuries, pointing toward a sustained and deliberate course of action rather than a momentary loss of control. Professor Joseph Scott Morgan, a respected forensic expert, explained that repeated injuries typically indicate intent, proximity, and prolonged effort. These are not the hallmarks of a sudden emotional outburst. They suggest control, persistence, and conscious action over time. Another deeply unsettling detail emerged from reports indicating that the couple may have been resting when the incident began. If accurate, this would imply that Nick had intimate knowledge of their daily routines, their habits, and the times when they were most defenseless. Investigators emphasized that actions carried out at such close range are deeply personal. They reflect controlled behavior, not detachment. This was not an act of chaos, but one rooted in proximity, familiarity, and sustained presence, elements that make the case profoundly difficult to comprehend. Soon after the arrest, attention shifted sharply to the legal aspects of the case, adding another layer of complexity to an already convoluted situation. The discovery that Nick had used family inheritance funds to hire Alan Jackson, one of the most well-known and expensive defense attorneys in the country, immediately sent shockwaves through the public and legal circles alike. The decision to hire such a high-profile lawyer so quickly raised immediate, urgent questions about the motivation behind it. Why was this legal move made with such speed and precision? Was it part of a larger, more calculated strategy to protect Nick from the consequences of his actions? Or was it a desperate, last-minute attempt to cover up something far darker, something that had been carefully hidden beneath the surface for much longer than anyone realized? The timing of the decision left the public and the authorities reeling, with more and more questions mounting with every passing day. As the days passed, further updates emerged, adding yet more layers of intrigue and mystery to the case. On December 18, 2025, multiple sources close to the family reported that the legal fees for Nick's defense were allegedly being covered by the Reiner estate, an estate that was valued at an astonishing $200 million. This new development further complicated the already murky situation, raising even more pressing legal and moral questions. According to insiders, the family believed that pursuing a mental health defense for Nick might be the most humane course of action. They felt this approach could not only offer Nick a chance at rehabilitation, but also honor what they believed Rob and Michelle would have wanted for their son. In their eyes, this was a way to seek understanding and compassion for someone who had long struggled with deep personal demons. But this defense strategy was far from simple. It was fraught with legal complications that would take the investigation into darker, more complex territory. In California, the law clearly states that anyone convicted of a crime like the one Nick is accused of cannot inherit from the victim's estate. This legal restriction added an overwhelming layer of tension to the already strained family dynamics. Nick's ability to benefit from the very inheritance funds that were now being used to pay for his defense was directly contradicted by the state's legal framework. But the family found a loophole. While Nick could not inherit the estate, the funds from the inheritance could still be used by other relatives or estate executors to cover his legal costs. This created a highly controversial and legally complex situation. On the surface, it seemed like a well-calculated, albeit morally questionable, decision to protect Nick from the full legal consequences of his actions. But it also sparked an outcry from the public, as people began to question whether the Reiner family was putting loyalty and protection over the pursuit of justice. Were they allowing their familial bond to override the need for accountability? The silence surrounding the origins of the legal funding only deepened the mystery and intensified the public's curiosity. As the investigation continued to unfold, each new revelation seemed to raise more questions than it answered, adding to the public's growing unease about the true nature of the case. With the family's decision to use the inheritance funds for Nick's defense in the spotlight, all eyes turned to the court proceedings, which were expected to provide the next set of answers, or at least further complicate the narrative. When Nick appeared in court for the first time, the weight of the moment was palpable. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as he entered, wearing the standard blue inmate uniform, a stark and sobering contrast to the life of privilege that his last name had once promised. Standing in front of the judge, with 2 counts of first-degree charges hanging over him, Nick looked every bit the figure of someone caught in the snare of their own choices. The life of wealth, fame, and success that his family name had once symbolized now felt distant and irrelevant in the face of such a monstrous charge. There he stood, a symbol of privilege gone wrong, his future uncertain and overshadowed by the severity of his actions. Beside him, Alan Jackson, his defense attorney, stood calm, composed, and utterly prepared, an embodiment of control in a situation that had spiraled out of control. The contrast between the 2 figures was striking. Jackson, ever the professional, was a stark reminder of the high-profile nature of the case and the massive resources being funneled into Nick's defense. With every passing moment, the courtroom seemed to grow heavier with the weight of what was happening, both inside the room and outside, where the public waited for answers. The hearing itself was tightly controlled, with no live cameras allowed, further fueling the public's insatiable curiosity. The courtroom, which usually buzzes with the sound of hushed whispers and nervous energy, was now cloaked in an almost eerie silence. The media frenzy outside only heightened the tension within. Everyone wanted to know what was really going on behind those closed doors, what was being said in private that would eventually shape the course of this haunting case. When the judge asked Nick if he would waive his right to a speedy trial, his response was quiet, almost detached. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." His words hung in the air, flat and emotionless, with no further explanation. His demeanor suggested little to no remorse or acknowledgement of the gravity of his actions. There was no outburst, no pleading for understanding, just a simple, matter-of-fact answer. This response left many in the room unsettled. What did it mean that Nick, facing such serious charges, could respond with such indifference? The hearing ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to follow Nick as he was escorted out of the courtroom. The weight of that silence spoke volumes, leaving everyone present with more questions than answers. As the case continued to unfold, it became clear that Nick's actions, both in the days leading up to the incident and afterward, would remain shrouded in mystery for a long time to come. With each new detail that emerged, the investigation took on a life of its own, driving deeper into the complicated web of family, law, and morality. And while Nick's defense strategy was still taking shape, one thing was certain: the journey ahead would be long and fraught with twists and turns. No one knew what the final outcome would be, but the echoes of this case, its complexity, its emotional turmoil, and its tragic consequences, would continue to reverberate throughout the public consciousness for years to come. As attention turns to the upcoming court date on January 7th, investigators have revisited a deeply troubling and painful aspect of the case: the long history of personal struggle that Nick had endured for much of his life. Born in 1993, Nick's journey through adolescence was marked by turmoil, with reports indicating that he began experimenting with substances as early as the age of 15. What started as a rebellious phase soon evolved into a lifelong cycle of addiction, rehab, and relapse, a vicious pattern that would shape his life for years to come. His family, recognizing the early warning signs, did everything in their power to intervene. Rob and Michelle, ever the devoted parents, made the difficult but necessary decision to send Nick to rehab while he was still a teenager, hoping that professional treatment could help him break free from the grip of addiction. Despite the setbacks, their commitment to helping him never wavered. They remained steadfast in their belief that Nick could turn his life around, and they continued to offer him a foundation of love, structure, and support. Throughout the years, however, Nick's battle with addiction proved relentless. No matter how much love and support Rob and Michelle poured into him, the grip of addiction remained unyielding. He moved between states, seeking refuge in different places, yet never finding the peace or stability he so desperately needed. His relationship with his family, particularly with his parents, became increasingly strained as the years wore on. The support they provided, while genuine and heartfelt, often felt like a temporary solution, unable to overcome the deep emotional turmoil Nick faced within himself. In 2015, there was a glimmer of hope. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Nick had finally found a sense of purpose. He stayed sober long enough to work on a film project with his father, a project that was deeply personal, as it mirrored many of Nick's own struggles. During that time, it seemed as though their bond was being repaired, as though the trust they had once lost was being slowly restored. For a brief time, the family allowed themselves to believe that they were seeing the fruits of their unwavering love and support, but the relief was short-lived. By 2018, Nick had relapsed once again, bringing chaos and unpredictability back into their lives. The cycle of hope, followed by disappointment, became a heartbreaking pattern. Rob and Michelle's belief in Nick's ability to overcome his demons never faltered, but the toll it took on them was undeniable. Their home, once a sanctuary of love and hope, had become a place of constant worry and emotional strain. The emotional volatility that Nick carried with him seemed to seep into every corner of their lives, and as his parents, they were left to navigate the painful realization that no matter how hard they tried, they could not fix him, not completely anyway. As the case continues to unfold, it has become increasingly clear that Nick's years of instability, emotional volatility, and unresolved trauma will play a significant role in his defense strategy. Experts predict that the defense may argue that the years of substance abuse, combined with the emotional turmoil, impaired Nick's ability to regulate his actions the night of the incident. Those close to the case suggest that the defense may attempt to portray Nick as a victim of his circumstances, someone whose mind and actions were severely affected by years of addiction and trauma. Witnesses who encountered Nick that night have described him as heavily impaired, his behavior erratic, almost as if he were operating on autopilot, disconnected from the reality around him. And yet, despite these accounts, Nick's actions on the night in question raise serious doubts about the extent of his impairment. The question looms: did his actions stem from a place of genuine confusion and uncontrollable impulses, or was there a deeper, more calculated decision behind them? What remains indisputable, however, is that the combination of emotional instability long stand. Trauma and substance abuse created the perfect storm. Even Conan O'Brien, who rarely discusses private matters publicly, was moved to release a brief statement expressing his sorrow and disbelief over the events. O'Brien's words echoed with a sense of shock that was felt across Hollywood and beyond. Nearly a year later, the case continues to dominate the headlines, with each new detail adding layers to the story. What was initially meant to be a joyful holiday celebration has now evolved into one of Hollywood's most haunting and tragic chapters. It serves as a stark reminder that fame, success, and wealth offer no protection from the internal battles that so many people face. Despite the love, the support, and the family devotion, Nick struggles with addiction, and his inability to overcome the emotional wounds of his past ultimately led to a devastating tragedy. A tragedy that forever changed the lives of everyone involved. It is a heartbreaking truth that sometimes, despite all the love and effort in the world, a family can still lose everything in a single night. The case has become more than just a story of crime and punishment. It is a reflection of the hidden struggles that many families face behind closed doors, where addiction, mental illness, and trauma are often ignored, dismissed, or misunderstood. In the end, this case is a sobering reminder that no one is immune from the consequences of their actions, and that even the most privileged among us can be trapped by forces beyond their control. As the investigation continues and the case moves forward, the questions about responsibility, guilt, and the impact of a lifetime of unresolved struggles will continue to haunt all those involved. The story is far from over, and its full impact is only just beginning to unfold.